The alarm on Sarah Henderson's phone buzzed at 5:47 a.m., 13 minutes before it was supposed to. Her eyes snapped open in the darkness of her small apartment, her heart already racing with the anxiety that had become her constant companion over the past 18 months. Today was the day, the final custody hearing. The day that would determine whether she would wake up to her daughter's voice each morning, or if that privilege would belong to someone else, someone she had come to fear and resent with an intensity that sometimes frightened her. Sarah sat up slowly, her body aching as if she'd aged a decade in the past year and a half. She padded barefoot across the cool hardwood floor to Emma's room, just to look at her daughter sleeping peacefully, unaware that her entire world was about to be shaken once again. Emma lay curled under her pink blanket, her chestnut hair splayed across the pillow, one arm hanging off the side of the bed. She looked so small, so vulnerable, so innocent of the adult world's cruelty that was about to descend upon her. Sarah's throat tightened as she watched her daughter sleep. She thought about how this little girl, this beautiful, intelligent, sensitive child, had become for a war between two people who were supposed to love her unconditionally. The irony was not lost on Sarah. She and Robert had created Emma together, and now they were tearing her apart, one custody argument at a time. In the living room, Buddy, their golden retriever service dog, lifted his head from his bed as Sarah passed. At 3 years old, Buddy had been trained specifically to detect anxiety and emotional distress in children. He had become Emma's anchor in the chaos of her parents' dissolution. The dog had a sixth sense about Emma's emotional state. He could feel her anxiety before she even consciously acknowledged it herself. He would press against her leg, rest his head on her lap, or simply sit beside her in silent companionship. That unconditional presence had saved Emma from complete emotional collapse on more than one occasion. "Not yet, boy," Sarah whispered, running her fingers through Buddy's golden fur. "Let her sleep a little longer." Sarah had barely slept. She'd spent the entire night reviewing case files, reading through the emails that her lawyer had marked as particularly damaging, and reliving the moments that had led them to this courtroom. The emails were the worst part. Robert's attorney had somehow obtained a series of messages between Sarah and her best friend, in which Sarah had vented her frustrations about Robert's controlling behavior, his narcissistic tendencies, and his apparent attempts to alienate Emma from her mother. Sarah had written things in anger and pain that, when read out of context in a courtroom, would sound absolutely damning. Words like, "He's poisoning her against me, and I'm afraid of what he's teaching her to believe about me." The truth was far more complicated. Robert wasn't evil. He was wounded, angry, and fighting for his daughter just as fiercely as Sarah was. But somewhere along the way, their fight had become less about what was best for Emma and more about winning. The family law system almost guaranteed this transformation. Once you entered into custody litigation, you were forced to present yourself as either the hero or the villain. There was no room for nuance, no space for the truth that both parents loved their child and were both capable of doing harm through their actions. Sarah's phone buzzed with a text from her lawyer. "Get here 45 minutes early. We need to prep. Judge is known for being unpredictable." This wasn't good news. An unpredictable judge meant a judge who hadn't made up her mind, which meant this would be a true battle. Sarah had been hoping that judge would see through Robert's manipulation tactics and recognize Sarah as the more stable parent. But if she was unpredictable, that meant anything could happen. By 7:15 a.m., Emma was awake. Sarah had gently shaken her shoulder, and Emma had opened her eyes with the wariness of a child who had learned that mornings often brought bad news. This was what the divorce had done to her. An 8-year-old should wake up excited about the day ahead, thinking about cartoons and cereal and playtime. Instead, Emma had learned to wake up afraid. "Good morning, baby," Sarah said, keeping her voice as light and normal as possible. "Today's the big day." Emma nodded slowly, sitting up and hugging her knees to her chest. She was wearing her favorite pajamas, the ones with the unicorns on them, and her hair was sticking up on one side. She looked impossibly young and impossibly old at the same time. "Am I going to see Daddy today?" she asked. "Not today, sweetheart. Today we're going to see the judge. Remember how we talked about this?" Emma nodded, but her eyes were fixed on some distant point beyond the window. Sarah recognized the signs of anxiety building. Emma's hands had begun to fidget with the hem of her blanket, a nervous habit that had developed over the past few months. Sarah's heart broke all over again. This wasn't what she had wanted for her daughter. This wasn't what anyone wanted. "Buddy will come with us," Sarah said, knowing this would provide some comfort. Service dogs were sometimes allowed in courtrooms, especially when there was clear documentation of their necessity. Emma's therapist had written a letter recommending that Buddy be present during the hearing, given his role in managing Emma's anxiety. Robert's lawyer had objected, of course. They had argued that Buddy's presence would be prejudicial, that it would unfairly sway the judge's emotions. Sarah's lawyer had fought back, citing research about the therapeutic benefits of service animals and the specific training that Buddy had. The judge had ultimately ruled that Buddy could be present in the courthouse, but would need to wait outside the courtroom itself during testimony. Emma's face brightened slightly at the mention of Buddy. "Really? Buddy gets to come?" "Yes, baby. Buddy gets to come. He'll be right outside the courtroom, and after we're done, we can all go home together." The drive to the courthouse seemed to take both 5 minutes and 5 hours simultaneously. Sarah gripped the steering wheel so hard her knuckles turned white. Emma sat in the back seat, Buddy's head resting on her lap. The dog seemed to understand the gravity of the moment. He was unusually quiet, his eyes tracking between Emma and Sarah, his body tense with an energy that mirrored the fear in the car. By 8:30 a.m., they were pulling into the courthouse parking lot. The building was an imposing structure of gray stone and marble, built during an era when courthouses were meant to look intimidating. Perhaps that was appropriate, Sarah thought bitterly. Justice was supposed to be serious and severe, but it wasn't supposed to crush the spirit of an innocent child. Emma's hand found Sarah's as they climbed the courthouse steps. Buddy walked beside them, his leash held firmly in Sarah's left hand. The morning sun was bright and cheerful, completely at odds with the darkness Emma felt inside. Sarah could feel her daughter trembling. "You're going to be okay," Sarah whispered, squeezing Emma's hand. "Whatever happens today, we're going to be okay. I promise you that." But as they reached the top of the steps and paused at the courthouse doors, Sarah wasn't sure she believed her own words. She looked down at her daughter, this small, brave girl who had done nothing to deserve any of this, and realized that sometimes promises couldn't be kept by parents alone. Sometimes the system itself conspired against you. Sometimes love wasn't enough. Emma took a deep breath. She looked at Buddy, found strength in the dog's steady presence, and together with her mother, she walked through the courthouse doors toward an uncertain future. In that moment, none of them knew that this day would change not just their lives, but would ultimately transform the entire legal system's approach to protecting children in custody disputes. All Emma knew was that she was scared, that she loved both her parents, and that she wished more than anything that they could all just go home and be a family again. The courtroom was already packed when Emma and Sarah arrived. Judge's reputation preceded her. She was known for being thorough, exacting, and utterly unpredictable. Some judges had a reputation for favoring mothers, others favored fathers. Judge had a reputation for favoring whoever seemed to have the strongest legal argument, regardless of gender. This terrified Sarah. It meant there were no safe assumptions, no established patterns to rely on. The gallery was filled with family members on both sides, journalists looking for a story, court observers, and various legal professionals. Emma immediately felt the weight of all those eyes upon her. She clung to her mother's hand as they made their way to the front, where Sarah's attorney was already seated. Was in his early 50s, with salt and pepper hair and the bearing of a man who had spent 25 years fighting custody battles. He'd won most of them, but Sarah could see the weariness in his eyes. This case had clearly taken its toll on him. "Sarah, Emma," he said quietly, gesturing for them to sit. "Remember what we discussed. I'm going to handle most of the questioning. You don't need to say anything unless I ask you directly. Just sit quietly and try to appear calm. The judge is watching everything, your body language, your expressions, how you interact with Emma. Everything matters." Sarah nodded, though her stomach was churning. She'd been told this before, but the weight of it never got lighter. In custody cases, you weren't just fighting with words. You were fighting with your entire existence, your entire being, laid bare for judgment. On the other side of the courtroom, Robert Henderson sat with his attorney, David Sterling. Sterling was a shark. Everyone in legal circles knew this. He'd built his career on aggressive cross-examinations and character assassinations. He didn't just win custody cases. He destroyed the opposing parent's credibility completely. Sarah had heard stories of mothers Sterling had represented who had walked out of courtrooms humiliated, their reputations in tatters. The fact that Robert had hired Sterling suggested that this case was going to be far uglier than Sarah had anticipated. Robert looked different than Sarah remembered. It had been 3 weeks since they'd last seen each other, and in that time he seemed to have aged. There were new lines around his eyes, and his face had taken on a gray pallor. He was dressed in an expensive suit, his hair perfectly styled, everything about him engineered to project trustworthiness and stability. Sarah caught his eye for just a moment, and she saw something in his expression that made her chest hurt. It looked like sadness. For just a fleeting second, she remembered why she had fallen in love with this man, why they had created Emma together. Then the moment passed and his expression hardened. He looked away. At precisely 9:00 a.m., the bailiff announced, "All rise," the honorable judge presiding. Judge entered with the bearing of someone accustomed to absolute authority. She was a woman in her late 60s, with silver hair pulled back in a neat bun and intelligent, penetrating gray eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. She didn't smile at anyone. She simply took her seat at the bench and looked down at the assembled crowd with an expression that suggested she had already seen enough human suffering and conflict to last her several lifetimes. "This is a custody hearing in the matter of Henderson v. Henderson regarding the minor child, Emma Henderson," the judge said, her voice crisp and clear. "Both parties are present with counsel. Before we proceed, I want to be clear about something. I have been a judge for 32 years. I have presided over hundreds of custody cases, and I am profoundly tired of watching parents use their children as weapons in their personal wars. This hearing will be conducted with respect and decorum. I will not tolerate personal attacks disguised as testimony. I will not tolerate attempts to manipulate or deceive this court. Both of you will answer my questions truthfully and directly. Is that understood?" "Yes, Your Honor," both and Sterling said simultaneously. "Good, Mr. Sterling. As the petitioner is seeking a modification of custody, you may proceed with your opening statement." David Sterling stood with practiced grace, adjusting his tie as he faced the judge. "Your Honor, we are not seeking to deny Mr. Henderson's ex-wife access to their daughter. We are simply seeking to ensure that Emma's best interests are protected and that she has a relationship with her father unencumbered by the prejudicial influence of her mother. The evidence we will present today will demonstrate that Ms. Henderson has systematically and deliberately alienated Emma from her father, has made false allegations about Mr. Henderson's character, and has attempted to manipulate Emma's emotions to turn her against her own parent." Sarah Felt's hand on her arm, a warning to remain calm, but her blood was boiling. False allegations. The controlling behavior was real. The emotional manipulation was real. She had documentation, email records, witness statements. How could he stand there and claim these were false allegations? "Furthermore," Sterling continued, "Ms. Henderson has failed to provide a stable environment for Emma. She has moved 3 times in the past year, has been unstable emotionally, and has allowed her own anger and resentment to poison her interactions with Mr. Henderson. Mr. Henderson, on the other hand, has maintained a stable home, steady employment, and has consistently fought to maintain a relationship with his daughter despite the obstacles placed in his path by Ms. Henderson's vindictive behavior. When stood to give his opening statement, his voice was measured and calm. "Your Honor, while my opponent paints a picture of parental alienation, the evidence will show that Ms. Henderson has made genuine, documented efforts to facilitate Emma's relationship with her father. What we will demonstrate is that Mr. Henderson's behavior pattern is one of control, manipulation, and emotional abuse, first toward his ex-wife, and now toward his daughter. The moves Ms. Henderson made were necessitated by Mr. Henderson's unwillingness to respect boundaries. The emotional instability Ms. Henderson has experienced is a direct result of the ongoing harassment and manipulation she has endured at Mr. Henderson's hands. Ms. Henderson does not seek to deny Mr. Henderson access to Emma. She seeks to protect Emma from an unhealthy and harmful relationship dynamic." The morning proceeded with testimony from various witnesses. Robert's sister about what a devoted father he was, painting a picture of a man who only wanted to spend time with his daughter. About Robert's stability and reliability at work. His therapist, whom he had strategically begun seeing 6 months ago, just before filing for the custody modification, that Robert was a well-adjusted, emotionally stable individual with no red flags. Then came the emails. Sterling projected them onto the courtroom screen one by one. Sarah felt her face burning as her own words, written in moments of anger and frustration, were displayed for everyone to see. "He's poisoning her against me. I'm terrified of what he's doing to Emma's mind. Sometimes I think he's a sociopath. Emma comes back from his house confused and upset every single time." The emails, taken out of context, painted Sarah as unstable, vindictive, and obsessed with turning Emma against her father. Sterling read them aloud with theatrical precision, letting every word hang in the air like an accusation. The gallery listened with rapt attention. This was the human drama, the emotional warfare that everyone had come to witness. Sarah wanted to scream. She wanted to explain the context, the reasons behind each email, the fact that these were private communications written to her best friend in moments of desperation. But she wasn't allowed to speak. She could only sit and watch as her own words, weaponized and distorted, destroyed her credibility in front of the judge. By the time the lunch break came at 12:30 p.m., the courtroom atmosphere had shifted palpably. The judge's expression had grown increasingly grave, increasingly skeptical of Sarah. Several members of the gallery were openly sympathetic to Robert. Sterling had done what he did best. He had turned the battlefield in his favor. In the hallway outside the courtroom during the break, Sarah slumped against the wall, sat beside her, his expression troubled. "We need to do damage control this afternoon," he said quietly. "The judge is questioning our narrative. We need stronger witnesses, stronger evidence. We need to make her understand the reality of what's happening here." But Sarah barely heard him. All she could think about was Emma, sitting with Sarah's sister in the hallway with Buddy, probably terrified about what would happen next. The morning's testimony had been brutal, and they were only halfway through the day. Whatever happened in this courtroom was going to change their lives forever. The afternoon session began at 2:00 p.m. sharp. Judge sat at the bench with what appeared to be fresh determination, having spent the lunch break reviewing case files and making notes. Sarah could see that the morning's testimony had affected her. The judge's expression was grave, her jaw set, her eyes harder than they had been before lunch. The first witnesses after lunch were Sarah's supporters, her therapist, Emma's school counselor, and a child psychologist who had evaluated Emma over the past 6 months. They all to Emma's emotional distress, her anxiety symptoms, and her apparent fear of disappointing either of her parents. The school counselor documented Emma's declining grades and her increasing social withdrawal. The psychologist presented research on parental alienation and how, contrary to Sterling's implications, Children rarely fabricate fears of a parent without legitimate reasons rooted in actual behavior patterns. But Sterling was relentless in his cross-examinations. He challenged the psychologist's methodology, questioned whether the school counselor had any actual expertise in custody matters, and suggested that Sarah's therapist had a financial incentive to support Sarah's narrative. He planted seeds of doubt about every piece of evidence, every expert opinion. By the time each witness left the stand, Sterling had managed to undermine their credibility enough that the judge seemed to be reconsidering her initial assessment. Sarah could feel the case slipping away from her, looked increasingly tense, occasionally scribbling notes and glancing at her with expressions of concern. This was not going as planned. Nothing was going as planned. Then, around 3:45 p.m., Judge made an announcement that made Sarah's heart stop. "I believe it would be helpful for this court to hear directly from the minor," the judge said, looking over her glasses at both attorneys. "Emma Henderson will take the witness stand. I want to hear in her own words about her relationship with both parents, her feelings about the custody arrangement, and any concerns she may have." Squeezed Sarah's arm, a gesture meant to be reassuring but which actually felt like a warning. This was the moment they had both been dreading. Putting Emma on the stand was dangerous. An 8-year-old child was unpredictable, suggestible, and emotionally fragile. One wrong question from Sterling could destroy everything, or worse, could damage Emma psychologically in ways that might never fully heal. But the judge had made her decision, and it was not open for debate. Sarah watched as her daughter was escorted into the courtroom. Emma looked impossibly small in the oversized courtroom chair. The bailiff placed a Bible in front of her, and Emma placed her small hand on it as she was sworn in. Sarah's chest ached watching this. Her baby, her sweet, innocent baby being placed in this formal, adversarial setting, being asked to choose between the two people she loved most in the world. Judge began gently. "Hello, Emma, I'm Judge. I know this is probably a little scary being in a big courtroom like this. Is that okay?" "Yes, ma'am," Emma said softly, her voice barely audible in the large room. "Emma, I'm going to ask you some questions about your mommy and your daddy. There are no right or wrong answers. I just want to know how you feel. Okay?" "Okay," Emma said. "Do you love your mommy?" "Yes," Emma said without hesitation. "Do you love your daddy?" "Yes," Emma said again. "Good. Now, Emma, can you tell me about the last time you visited your daddy?" Emma's hands began to fidget with the hem of her dress. We went to the park, and then we got ice cream, and then he said that mommy was being mean to him and that she didn't want me to see him anymore." The courtroom shifted slightly. Sarah saw Robert's eyes widen, saw Sterling lean over to whisper something to his client. "Did that make you feel sad?" Judge asked gently. "Yes," Emma said, "because I don't think mommy is being mean. Mommy loves me, but Daddy says she doesn't love him anymore and that she's trying to keep us apart." Judge nodded thoughtfully. "And when your daddy says these things, how does it make you feel?" Emma's lower lip began to tremble. "It makes me feel confused, because mommy says that Daddy was mean to her and she says he's trying to turn me against her, and I don't want to choose. I don't want to say that one of them is bad and the other one is good. I love them both." Sarah felt tears streaming down her face. This was exactly what she had feared. Emma was being forced to articulate the impossible position she had been placed in. The emotional toll was visible on her daughter's face. Then Sterling stood up for cross-examination. His tone, which had been relatively civil with the adult witnesses, changed immediately when addressing Emma. He became gentler, more paternal, but also more insidious. Every question was designed to plant suggestions, to lead Emma toward specific answers that would support his narrative. "Emma, when you visit your father, does he make you feel safe?" "Yes," Emma said. "And when you're with your mother, does she tell you things about your father?" Emma hesitated. "Sometimes she says he was mean to her." Does she ever tell you not to see your father?" "No," Emma said, "but she sometimes looks sad when I say I'm going to see him." Sterling pressed harder. "Has your mother ever told you that your father doesn't love you?" "No," Emma said quietly, "but she said that he might try to say things that aren't true about her." "So your mother has told you to be suspicious of your father, to not believe things he says?" "She just said to tell her if Daddy says something that doesn't feel right," Emma said, her voice getting quieter. Sarah watched in horror as Sterling twisted Emma's words, using her own testimony against her. He was creating a narrative where Sarah had poisoned Emma against Robert, where Emma had been coached and manipulated. The truth, that Sarah had simply tried to help her daughter navigate a confusing and painful situation, was being distorted into something sinister. Emma's anxiety was clearly escalating. She was starting to cry. Her hands were shaking. Her voice became barely audible. Every answer felt like a betrayal to someone. If she said something positive about her mother, she feared hurting her father. If she said something positive about her father, she feared hurting her mother. She was trapped in an impossible situation, and the legal system, which was supposed to protect her, was actually causing her more harm. Then Sterling asked the question that broke her completely. "Emma, if you had to choose, and I know this is hard, but if you had to choose right now between living with your mother or your father, who would you choose?" Emma's face crumpled. She looked toward her mother, then toward her father, then back to the judge. "I don't want to choose," she whispered. "I don't want to choose. I just want my family to be okay. I want Mommy and Daddy to stop being mad at each other." Stood up immediately. "Your Honor, I object. This line of questioning is inappropriate and is causing emotional distress to the minor." Judge nodded, her expression darkening. "Sustained. Mr. Sterling, we are not asking this child to make custody determinations. The court will make those determinations based on the evidence presented." But the damage was done. Emma was sobbing now, her entire body shaking. A court officer brought her tissues. Judge called for a recess, and Emma was led out of the courtroom by a victim advocate. Sarah watched her daughter leave, tears streaming down her face, feeling utterly helpless. In that moment, as Sarah watched Emma disappear from the courtroom, she realized something crucial. Regardless of what happened in this hearing, regardless of which judge awarded custody to whom, her daughter had already lost something profound. Her sense of safety, her sense of belonging, her sense that her parents would put her needs above their own need to win, all of it had been shattered by this legal process. The system had failed Emma before either judge had even made a ruling. And yet, neither Sarah nor Robert knew what was about to happen next, something so extraordinary that it would change everything. Emma sat in the small waiting room outside the courtroom with her aunt, Sarah's younger sister, and Buddy. The dog had sensed her distress the moment she'd been led out of the courtroom. He pressed against her legs, his warm body providing an anchor to something real, something unconditional, something that didn't ask her to choose or perform or lie. Buddy's presence was the only thing keeping Emma from completely falling apart. "You did so good in there, sweetie," Aunt said gently, rubbing Emma's back. But they both knew this wasn't true. Emma hadn't done good. Emma had been torn apart by a process designed to extract testimony from someone far too young and emotionally fragile to handle the adversarial nature of cross-examination. Emma's hands were still trembling. Her eyes were red and swollen from crying. Her voice had gone hoarse from the effort of trying to answer impossible questions while holding back tears. She leaned down and buried her face in Buddy's golden fur, breathing in his familiar scent, a combination of dog shampoo and the outdoor air that clung to him. This was her safe place. This was where she could exist without having to choose, without having to perform, without having to be anyone other than a scared 8-year-old girl. Inside the courtroom, Judge was speaking privately with both attorneys. Sarah could hear the muffled tones of conversation but couldn't make out the words. She was consumed by guilt and anger and helplessness in equal measure. She had brought Emma into this world. She was supposed to protect her. And yet, the very legal system designed to protect children had just exposed Emma to emotional trauma in front of dozens of strangers. Robert sat rigidly in his chair, his jaw clenched. He wasn't looking at Sarah, but she could see the tension in his shoulders. He had heard Emma's testimony too. Regardless of whether he was truly the man Sarah believed him to be, he had to have realized that his daughter was suffering. Unless, Sarah thought bitterly, he had compartmentalized her suffering as an acceptable cost of winning this case. The recess lasted 37 minutes. When Judge finally returned to the bench and the bailiff called for order, the judge's expression was complicated. It contained frustration, sadness, and something else that Sarah couldn't quite identify. Perhaps it was doubt. Perhaps it was the beginning of recognition that something was fundamentally broken about this entire process. "We will reconvene tomorrow morning at 9:00 a.m., Judge announced. "At that time, we will hear closing arguments from both counsel. I will then take the case under advisement and will issue a ruling within 2 weeks. Court is adjourned." The gavel came down with finality. It was over. The hearing was finished, and they were no closer to resolution than they had been that morning. Sarah felt a strange mixture of relief and dread. The worst was behind them, but also the worst was yet to come. The waiting, the uncertainty, the not knowing which version of her life she would be living in 2 weeks. As the courtroom emptied, Sarah gathered her belongings and made her way toward the hallway where Emma was waiting. She needed to see her daughter, needed to hold her, needed to reassure her that everything would be okay. But how could she make such a promise when she had no idea if it was true? In the hallway, Buddy heard Sarah's footsteps before Emma did. The dog's head lifted, his ears perked forward. He released a small whine, not distressed but expectant. He knew Sarah was coming. He had been trained to recognize the sounds and patterns of people he was bonded to. Aunt saw Sarah approaching and gathered up her purse, preparing to give her sister and niece some space. "I'll wait by the car," said. "Take your time." Sarah collapsed beside Emma, pulling her daughter into her arms. Emma immediately began crying again, not the controlled sobs from the courtroom, but deep, wrenching cries that seemed to come from somewhere primal, somewhere wounded and afraid. Sarah held her tight, stroking her hair, whispering reassurances that she wasn't sure she believed. "I'm sorry, baby, I'm so sorry. You were so brave in there." "I don't want to do this anymore," Emma said between sobs. "I don't want to go to court anymore. I don't want to talk about Daddy and you fighting. I just want to be your daughter. I don't want to be part of a case." The words struck Sarah like physical blows. Her daughter had articulated something that most adults didn't understand, that to be a child in a custody dispute was to be transformed from a person into a piece of evidence, from a daughter into a witness, from a human being with needs and feelings into an item to be litigated over. Buddy pressed closer to Emma, sensing the depth of her distress. The dog had been trained to recognize specific signs of anxiety in children: the rapid breathing, the trembling, the way the body contracted inward as if trying to make itself smaller and less visible. Buddy knew what to do. He pressed his entire body against Emma's side, resting his head on her lap, and he simply existed beside her in her pain. Over the next several hours, as they sat in the car parked outside the courthouse, as they drove home in silence, as they went through the motions of dinner and bedtime, Emma remained in a state of heightened anxiety. She was jumpy, easily startled, and she clung to Buddy as if the dog were a life preserver in a storm. That night, as Sarah tucked Emma into bed, she taught her daughter something new. Over the weeks leading up to the custody hearing, Sarah had worked with Buddy's trainer to develop a special signal, something Emma could use if her anxiety became overwhelming and she needed Buddy's immediate intervention. The signal was simple but distinctive: 3 gentle scratches on the side of her neck. "If you ever feel really scared or really anxious," Sarah explained to Emma as she demonstrated the signal, scratching gently at her own neck 3 times, "you can make this signal and Buddy will know to come to you right away. It's like a secret language between you and him. Okay. Emma had practiced the signal several times that evening. Buddy responded immediately every time, rushing to Emma's side and pressing against her. The dog seemed to understand the gravity of what he was being asked to do. This wasn't just another trick. This was a lifeline for a child in distress. But what Emma didn't know, what Sarah didn't fully anticipate, was just how critical this signal would become. She didn't know that in less than 24 hours, her daughter would be pushed to the absolute breaking point. She didn't know that Emma would be forced to make an impossible choice in a public courtroom, in front of judges and lawyers and strangers. She didn't know that a child's desperate gesture and a dog's unconditional response would combine to create a moment of truth so powerful that it would reshape the entire legal proceeding. All Sarah knew that night, as she kissed her daughter goodnight and watched Buddy curl up at the foot of Emma's bed, was that she had given her child a tool, a resource, a way to communicate her suffering when words failed. It was the best she could do in an impossible situation. It was love expressed through the only means available to her, by creating a connection between her daughter and an animal who would never ask Emma to choose, who would never demand that she take sides, who would never use her as a weapon in an adult conflict. As Sarah left Emma's room and returned to her own bedroom to lie awake through another sleepless night, she had no idea that tomorrow, this simple signal, this small gesture of a child reaching out to her dog, would change everything. The morning of the closing arguments arrived with the same cheerful sunshine that seemed completely oblivious to the gravity of the proceedings about to unfold. Emma woke early, her stomach in knots. She could feel the weight of the day pressing down on her even before she was fully conscious. Today was the day when the lawyers would make their final arguments, when they would present their closing cases to judge, and when the judge would take the case under advisement. Emma dressed mechanically, pulling on the same navy dress she had worn the day before. Buddy stayed close to her throughout the morning, never venturing more than a few feet from her side. Sarah watched her daughter move through the morning routine like a ghost, eating breakfast without tasting it, brushing her teeth without really thinking about it, existing in a state of dissociation that Sarah recognized from her own anxiety struggles. "Buddy comes with us again today?" Emma asked as they prepared to leave the apartment. "Yes, baby, Buddy comes with us. He'll be right outside the courtroom just like yesterday." Emma nodded and reached down to stroke Buddy's ears. The dog leaned into her touch, his golden eyes soft and understanding. If dogs could communicate in words, Sarah imagined Buddy would be saying something like, "I'm here. I'm not going anywhere. Whatever happens in that courtroom, we'll get through it together." The drive to the courthouse was quieter than the day before. Yesterday had been filled with nervous chatter, with attempts to prepare Emma for what was coming. Today there was nothing left to prepare for. The hearing was almost over. In a few hours, it would be finished, and they would return to the agonizing waiting period while Judge decided their fate. By 8:45 a.m., they were seated in the courtroom gallery once again. Buddy was tethered to a chair just outside the courtroom doors, where he could see Emma if anyone happened to look through the small window in the courtroom door. Sarah's sister had arranged to wait with Buddy in the hallway, keeping him calm and comfortable while the proceedings continued inside. The closing arguments began at 9:00 a.m. sharp. Sterling went first, presenting his closing with theatrical precision. He reminded the judge of the damaging emails, of the testimony suggesting parental alienation, of the witnesses who had painted Robert as a stable, devoted father. He suggested that Sarah's emotional instability and her vindictive nature were the real threats to Emma's. He argued that while both parents loved Emma, only Robert could provide the stable, emotionally healthy environment she needed. His argument was well-constructed, compelling, and utterly effective. Then stood to present Sarah's closing argument. He reminded the judge of the documented patterns of Robert's controlling behavior, of the expert testimony about the effects of parental conflict on children, of the school records showing Emma's deterioration in her father's presence. He acknowledged that Sarah was not a perfect parent, but he argued that perfection was not the standard. The standard was best interests of the child, and Emma's best interests were clearly served by remaining in her mother's primary custody. But Sarah could see the doubt in Judge's eyes. The judge had listened to hours of testimony, had reviewed hundreds of pages of documentation, and had been forced to make an impossible decision based on competing narratives and incomplete information. The law required the judge to determine which parent could better serve the child's interests, but how could anyone really know? How could any judge, no matter how experienced, look into the future and determine which custody arrangement would lead to the best outcomes? It was around 10:30 a.m., when the closing arguments were wrapping up, that things began to shift. Emma had been sitting quietly throughout the proceedings, coloring in a coloring book that Aunt had brought for her. She was trying to be brave, trying to be the good girl that custody litigation demanded. But as finished his closing argument and the judge began to speak about next steps, something inside Emma began to break. She could feel her heart rate accelerating. Her palms began to sweat. The room seemed to be closing in on her. In just a few more minutes, the judge was going to dismiss them. The hearing was going to be over, and still nothing had changed. Her parents were still in conflict. She was still caught between them, and now the judge was going to make a decision that would irrevocably alter her life. Her breathing became shallow and rapid. The symptoms of an anxiety attack were beginning to manifest, the same panic that had gripped her during yesterday's cross-examination. Sarah noticed immediately. She reached over and squeezed Emma's hand, but even her mother's touch couldn't ground her this time. The anxiety was too deep, too overwhelming, too connected to the fundamental helplessness of her situation. Emma's eyes began to blur with tears. Her hands started to shake. She looked toward the courtroom door, beyond which Buddy waited in the hallway. She thought about the signal. She thought about the secret language she and Buddy had created together. And in that moment of desperate need, with no other resource available to her, Emma lifted her trembling hand to her neck. 3 scratches, the signal, the call for help. In the hallway, Aunt was scrolling through her phone, half watching Buddy, who was lying peacefully on the floor beside her chair. The dog had been calm, patient, the picture of a well-trained service animal waiting for his young charge to return. But then something shifted. Buddy's head lifted, his ears perked forward, his nostrils flared slightly as he caught some scent, some signal that Emma had sent. Didn't understand what was happening, but she could see that Buddy's entire body was now tense with alertness. The dog whined softly, a sound that had never heard Buddy make before. It was a whine of urgency, of concern, of purpose. The dog stood up, pulling slightly on his leash. His dark eyes fixed on the door to the courtroom. Recognized the signs. This was not a dog wanting to go for a walk or get a treat. This was a service dog who had recognized that his child needed him. Hesitated for only a moment. She had watched Emma teach Buddy the signal. She had seen how the dog responded immediately every time Emma made that scratching gesture. She understood, on some level that she couldn't fully articulate, that Buddy was communicating something real and urgent about Emma's emotional state. The bailiff had stepped back into the courtroom for a moment, leaving the door slightly ajar. Without making a conscious decision, operating purely on instinct and on faith in the bond between dog and child, unclipped Buddy's leash. The golden retriever didn't hesitate. He bolted through the partially open door, his paws clicking rapidly against the marble courtroom floor. The sound echoed through the cavernous space like gunshots. Every head turned, every eye fixed on the golden dog racing down the center aisle of the courtroom. The judge's gavel froze midair. Sterling stood up, his mouth opening as if to object or protest, but no words came out. Robert's eyes widened in shock. Sarah gasped, one hand flying to her mouth. And Buddy, with the singular focus of a dog who understood his purpose, raced directly to the witness box where he had last seen Emma, where he had sensed her distress emanating from just moments before. He found his girl in the gallery, pressed against her mother's side, and with perfect instinctive accuracy, he pressed his entire body against her legs and rested his head directly on her lap. The room fell into stunned silence. Emma's arms came around Buddy's neck, and she buried her face in his golden fur. Her breathing, which had been rapid and panicked, began to slow. Her trembling began to ease. The panic attack that had been building toward its crescendo began to subside in the presence of unconditional, non-judgmental animal love. Judge had not moved. She was staring at the scene before her with an expression that transcended the boundaries of judicial neutrality. This was not a moment about custody law or family court procedure. This was a moment about the fundamental human need for comfort and safety. This was a moment about the profound communication that could exist between a child and an animal. This was a moment about something real and true breaking through the artificiality and adversarial nature of legal proceedings. And in that moment, Judge began to understand something crucial about this case, something that no testimony or documentation or closing argument could have conveyed as powerfully as the simple fact of a dog, responding to a child's unspoken distress, pressing against her with unconditional presence. For a full 10 seconds, an eternity in courtroom time, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The only sound was Emma's muffled crying into Buddy's fur, and the soft, steady breathing of a dog who had just accomplished exactly what he was trained to do: provide comfort to a child in distress. Judge sat motionless on the bench, her gavel still frozen in the air. Her gray eyes, which had observed countless human dramas and legal controversies over 32 years of judicial service, were fixed on the scene unfolding before her with an intensity that suggested she was witnessing something genuinely extraordinary. Her expression was difficult to read. It contained shock, certainly, but also something deeper, something like recognition. The bailiff began to move toward Buddy, reaching down as if to physically remove the dog from the courtroom. It was protocol, after all. Animals were not permitted in the courthouse except in very specific circumstances, and this was clearly not one of them. But before the bailiff could actually touch Buddy, Judge raised her hand with quiet authority. "Don't," she said simply. Just one word, but it carried absolute power. The bailiff immediately stopped, his hands suspended in midair, unsure what to do. "Everyone remain seated," Judge continued, her voice measured and thoughtful. She slowly set down her gavel on the bench in front of her. She removed her glasses and set them aside carefully, as if she was deliberately removing a barrier between herself and the reality of what was happening before her. For a moment, she simply observed. She watched as Emma's breathing gradually stabilized. She watched as Buddy's presence seemed to transform an acutely anxious child into something resembling calm. She watched as the physical manifestation of the human-animal bond played out in real time before her. "I have been a judge for 32 years, Judge said, her voice carrying clearly throughout the now silent courtroom. "I have presided over more custody cases than I can count. I have listened to thousands of hours of testimony, reviewed thousands of pages of documentation, and made hundreds of custody determinations. I have never in my entire career witnessed anything quite like what I just observed." She paused, letting her gaze move slowly across the courtroom. First to Sarah, then to Robert, then to the attorneys, and finally back to Emma and Buddy. "What I just witnessed was not a violation of courtroom procedure," Judge continued. "What I just witnessed was a profound and authentic expression of emotional truth. This dog did not receive any command from anyone in this room to enter this courtroom. This dog was not trained to interrupt proceedings. This dog responded to a child's emotional distress with intuitive, unconditional presence. And in doing so, this animal has communicated something to this court that hours of testimony could not." Sterling stood up, as if to object or protest, but one look from Judge silenced him before he could speak. "Mr. Sterling, I suggest you remain seated. I am not finished." Sterling sat down heavily. Judge leaned forward on her bench, her eyes still fixed on Emma. "Young lady, I would like to ask you something. That dog came into this courtroom seemingly out of nowhere. Did you call him?" Emma looked up from Buddy's fur, her face tear-stained and vulnerable. She hesitated for just a moment, perhaps worried that admitting the truth would get her in trouble. But then she nodded. "I made the signal," she said softly. "The signal Mommy taught me, when I feel really scared or really anxious." "And what is that signal?" Judge asked gently. Emma lifted her hand to her neck and made 3 small scratching motions. "This," she said. "Buddy knows what it means." Judge's expression shifted. Her eyes, which had been sharp and analytical, became softer, more penetrating in a different way. "And you were feeling scared or anxious just now, during the closing arguments?" "Yes," Emma said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I was scared. I didn't want the hearing to be over because I still don't want to choose. But I was also scared because the hearing was going to be over and I still can't choose." The words hung in the courtroom like a confession of something profound and true. Sarah felt tears streaming down her face. Robert's jaw clenched visibly. The bailiff looked away, clearly moved by the child's statement. Judge sat back in her chair slowly. She picked her glasses back up and put them on, then removed them again, as if she couldn't quite decide what lens she wanted to view this situation through. "Emma, I want you to know that you are not supposed to choose. Do you understand that? My job as the judge is to decide what is best for you. Your job is simply to be a child. You should never have been put in a position where you felt you had to choose between your mother and your father." Emma began to cry harder, but these seemed like different tears. Less panicked, more relieved. As if hearing a judge, an authority figure, tell her that the impossible thing she had been asked to do was not her responsibility was somehow liberating. Judge looked at both attorneys. "I want to take a recess," she announced. "A substantial recess. I would like both counsel and both parties to meet with me in my chambers. We are going to have a conversation about what is actually in the best interests of this child, and I can assure you, it is not the continuation of this adversarial proceeding in its current form." She turned to the bailiff. "Allow the dog to remain with the child. I don't want this animal separated from Emma at this time." The bailiff nodded, clearly relieved that he wouldn't have to forcibly remove Buddy from a courtroom where his presence had become impossible to deny or dismiss. Judge stood up, her black robes rustling. "We will reconvene in 1 hour. I suggest you all use that time wisely to consider what you are really fighting for here." With that, she left the bench, disappearing into her chambers. The courtroom erupted in hushed conversation. Journalists were frantically taking notes. Legal observers were leaning over to each other, whispering in excitement about what they had just witnessed. This was not how custody hearings were supposed to go. This was not following any established protocol or procedure, but somehow it felt like justice. It felt like truth. It felt like something real breaking through the artificiality of legal proceedings. Sarah moved closer to Emma, wrapping her arms around both her daughter and the dog. Robert sat in his chair, his expression unreadable. Sterling was frantically flipping through pages in his legal files, as if searching for some precedent or rule that he could cite to explain or contextualize what had just happened. But there was no precedent. There was no rule. What had happened was unprecedented in Judge's 32-year career. A service dog's response to a child's distress had cut through hours of legal argumentation and expert testimony, and suddenly made the entire point of the litigation crystal clear. This case was not about custody law or parental fitness or custody arrangements. This case was about a child who was suffering, who was being harmed by the very process designed to protect her, and who had found a way, through an animal's unconditional love, to communicate that suffering to someone with the power to do something about it. In her chambers, Judge sat at her desk and pulled out a blank legal pad. She began to write, not a ruling or a judgment, but notes to herself about what she had witnessed and what it meant. She had 32 years of judicial experience and training, and she was throwing much of it aside because a dog had shown her something more true than any cross-examination ever could. That love and presence and safety were more important than winning. That healing was more important than judgment. That protecting children meant sometimes stepping outside the strict boundaries of legal procedure and acknowledging the deeper truths that emerged when you simply allowed yourself to see them. Judge's chambers were smaller than Emma might have imagined, not the imposing, intimidating space that courtrooms embodied, but rather something more intimate and human-scaled. There was a large wooden desk cluttered with legal files and photographs of what appeared to be the judge's own. Behind the desk hung framed diplomas and certificates of achievement. The walls were lined with law books, but also with prints of nature scenes, mountains, forests, oceans. Judge had clearly tried to create a space that contained both the seriousness of law and the gentleness of life. Emma sat in a chair slightly too big for her frame, Buddy pressed against her legs. Sarah sat beside her daughter, her hand resting protectively on Emma's shoulder. Across from them sat Robert, his attorney David Sterling beside him, looking increasingly uncomfortable with the direction this case was taking. Sarah's attorney stood near the door, his expression thoughtful and cautious. Judge sat behind her desk, but she had removed her robes, hanging them carefully on a stand in the corner. Without the formal garb, she somehow seemed both more powerful and more approachable. She was simply a woman now, an older woman with gray hair and intelligent eyes who had decided that justice required something more than legal protocol. "I want to begin," Judge said, her voice gentle but firm, "by saying that this conversation is informal but it is important. I am going to ask you all some questions and I want honest answers. Not answers designed to win your case. Not answers designed to make you look good. I want the truth. Understood?" Everyone nodded. "Emma, sweetheart, I would like to start with you," Judge said. She rolled her desk chair around to the side so she was no longer sitting elevated above the child, but rather at her level. "I have a question that I need you to think about very carefully before you answer. There are no wrong answers. I just want the truth. Can you do that?" "Yes," Emma said softly. "When you visit your father, how do you feel?" Judge asked. "Not what you think you should say, not what you think will make anyone happy, just how do you actually feel?" Emma's hands twisted together in her lap. Buddy noticed her anxiety and adjusted his position, pressing more firmly against her. She took several deep breaths before answering. "I feel confused," she said finally. "Because Daddy is nice to me when we're together. He's fun and he pays attention to me. But sometimes he says things about Mommy that don't match what I know about Mommy. And sometimes he asks me about Mommy's boyfriends or asks me to tell him things that happened when I wasn't with him. It feels like he wants me to spy on her." Robert started to object, but Judge held up her hand. "Mr. Henderson, you will have your turn to speak. Emma, continue." "And sometimes," Emma said, gaining confidence from the permission to speak without interruption, "he tells me that Mommy is trying to keep us apart. But Mommy doesn't try to do that. She always lets me see him. She just gets sad when I have to leave. And that makes me feel guilty, like I'm doing something wrong by loving my dad." "And when you're with your mother," Judge asked gently, "how do you feel then?" "Safer," Emma said immediately. "But also sad sometimes because I know Mommy is worried about me. I can feel how much stress she's under. She tries to hide it, but I can tell. And I know I'm part of why she's stressed because of this case." Judge nodded thoughtfully. She turned to Sarah. "Ms. Henderson, I want to ask you something directly. Have you ever deliberately tried to prevent Emma from seeing her father or to turn her against him?" Sarah's voice was steady when she answered. "No, I have never prevented her from seeing her father. There have been times when I have expressed concern about specific behaviors or situations, and I have tried to help Emma process her feelings about those situations. But I have never said to her, 'Your father is bad,' or 'Don't go see your father,' or anything like that." "Have you ever spoken negatively about her father in Emma's presence, or where Emma could overhear?" Sarah hesitated. This was the moment of truth. Yes, she admitted. I have. Not in front of Emma directly, but she's heard me on phone calls with my therapist or my friends. I've been angry and hurt, and I've said things about her father that were not kind. I regret that. I shouldn't have let my emotions spill over where Emma could hear them. Judge turned to Robert. Mr. Henderson, I would like to ask you something. The emails presented by your attorney during this hearing, emails where Ms. Henderson expressed concern about parental alienation and your behavior. Have you ever intentionally tried to create distance between Emma and her mother? Robert's jaw tightened. For a long moment, he didn't answer. Then very quietly he said, I don't think what I've done constitutes deliberate alienation. I've simply tried to maintain a relationship with my daughter. That's not what I asked, Judge said gently but firmly. I asked if you have intentionally tried to create distance between Emma and her mother. Robert looked away, his hands clenched and unclenched. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible. I've been angry with Sarah. I felt like she took Emma away from me when we separated. And yes, I may have influenced Emma's perspective on some things. I may have said things that weren't fair to Sarah, but I was hurting, and I thought if Emma understood my side of things, she might want to spend more time with me. The admission hung in the air. Even Sterling seemed surprised by his client's candor. So what you're telling me, Judge said slowly, is that both of you, in your anger and hurt, have made choices that have negatively impacted your daughter. Is that accurate? Both Sarah and Robert nodded. And Emma, Judge said, turning back to the child, what you're telling me is that you love both your parents, but you're exhausted by the conflict between them. You're carrying the burden of their war. Is that right? Yes, Emma said, tears beginning to stream down her face again. I just want them to stop fighting. I want Daddy to not be mad at Mommy, and I want Mommy to not be scared of Daddy, and I want to not have to feel guilty about loving both of them. Judge stood up and walked over to Emma. She knelt down beside the child, an extraordinary gesture for a judge in formal proceedings, and looked Emma directly in the eyes. Emma, I want you to know something very important. The fact that you love both your parents is not a problem. It is beautiful and natural and good. The problem is not you. The problem is that your parents forgot in the midst of their anger that you existed. That you were a person with your own feelings and needs that were separate from their conflict. She turned to look at both Sarah and Robert. And I want you both to hear this very clearly. Your daughter has just told you the truth. She has told you that she feels caught between you. She has told you that she doesn't want to choose. And she has had to tell you these things to a judge in a courtroom because you were not listening to her on your own. Judge stood back up and returned to her position behind her desk. I am going to make a ruling today, but before I do, I need to know, are either of you willing to fundamentally change how you approach this situation? Are you willing to put Emma's needs ahead of your own anger and hurt? Sarah spoke first. Yes, I will do whatever it takes to help Emma feel safe and to protect her from adult conflict. Robert took longer to respond, but finally he nodded. Yes, I don't want my daughter to feel guilty for loving me. I don't want her to feel like she's caught between us. Good, Judge said, because my ruling is going to reflect that commitment. And if either of you violates this commitment, there will be consequences. Understand? They both nodded. Judge began to speak, outlining the framework for a new custody arrangement, one that prioritized Emma's emotional over either parent's desire to win. She spoke about co-parenting therapy, about specific restrictions on discussing the conflict with Emma, about the judge's ability to revisit the arrangement if either parent violated these provisions. But more importantly, she spoke about the role that Buddy had played in opening everyone's eyes to what was really at stake. She spoke about how an animal's unconditional presence had revealed truths that hours of testimony could not. She spoke about how sometimes the most powerful communication comes not through words, but through the simple act of showing up for someone you love. As Judge spoke, Emma sat with Buddy's head resting on her lap, and for the first time in months, she felt like she could breathe. 3 months had passed since the extraordinary day in Judge's courtroom. The seasons had shifted, and what had been the brutal heat of summer was now giving way to the gentler warmth of early autumn. Life had changed in ways both subtle and profound. Emma sat in her mother's living room on a Saturday afternoon, a math worksheet spread out on the coffee table in front of her. Buddy lay with his head resting on her lap, and she occasionally reached down to scratch behind his ears as she worked through the problems. This had become their routine. Homework time was Buddy time. The dog's presence seemed to calm the anxiety that had once accompanied Emma's schoolwork, allowing her to focus and think clearly. What was remarkable about this moment was not what was happening in the living room, but what was about to happen. Emma's father would be arriving in approximately 30 minutes for their scheduled visit. And for the first time since the custody hearing had begun 14 months ago, Emma felt no anxiety about this visit. No dread. No feeling of being trapped between two warring factions. Sarah was in the kitchen, preparing a simple dinner that she and Emma would eat after Robert picked Emma up. But what was different now was that Sarah was not doing this while crying or worrying or stewing in resentment. Instead, she hummed quietly to herself as she chopped vegetables. She had been attending co-parenting counseling with Robert, the mandate from Judge that both parents had committed to. And slowly, incrementally, they were learning to see each other not as enemies, but as two people who shared a fundamental love for their daughter, even if their romantic love had long since died. The transformation had not been instant or easy. The first co-parenting session, 6 weeks after the hearing, had been excruciating. Both Sarah and Robert had come armed with grievances and accusations. Robert's therapist had gently but firmly told them both that if they could not commit to a different way of communicating, they would need to involve Judge again, and the judge had made it clear that future violations of her orders would result in serious consequences. The threat of judicial intervention, combined with the memory of Emma's tears and Buddy's interruption of courtroom proceedings, had been enough to make both parents reconsider their approach. Slowly, over the course of multiple sessions, they had begun to understand something crucial. They did not have to like each other or even respect each other to co-parent effectively. They simply had to commit to not using Emma as a weapon or a messenger or a prize to be won. They had to commit to shielding her from their adult conflict and to supporting her relationship with both of them, regardless of their personal feelings. Robert had made significant changes in his own behavior. He no longer asked Emma questions designed to elicit information about her mother's personal life. He no longer made derogatory comments about Sarah or suggested that Emma was being alienated. He had, in fact, begun his own individual therapy to process his feelings of loss and betrayal related to the divorce. It was not easy work, but he was doing it, not for Sarah, but for Emma. Sarah had made changes as well. She had increased her own therapy sessions and had learned better emotional regulation techniques. She no longer spoke negatively about Robert, even in contexts where she thought Emma wouldn't hear. She had learned to compartmentalize her anger and resentment and to present a more emotionally stable front to her daughter. She had also learned to actively encourage Emma's relationship with her father, even when it was difficult to do so. The result of all these changes was visible in Emma herself. Her grades had improved dramatically. She was sleeping better with fewer nightmares. She had stopped having panic attacks. She had friends at school again. She was, in short, becoming a normal, healthy 8-year-old girl rather than a child caught in the crossfire of adult conflict. The doorbell rang at 3:47 p.m., 13 minutes earlier than expected. Emma looked up from her homework, and for a moment her old anxiety tried to surface. But Buddy, sensing the small spike in her emotional state, simply pressed closer to her, and the anxiety dissipated almost immediately. Emma had learned that she could use Buddy's calming presence to regulate her own emotions, and she used this tool constantly. "That must be your dad," Sarah said, appearing from the kitchen and wiping her hands on a towel. She opened the door to find Robert standing there, looking nervous but determined. "Hi," he said, looking past Sarah to Emma. "Ready for our visit, kiddo?" "Yeah," Emma said, standing up and giving Buddy one final ear scratch. "Let me get my backpack." What happened next was something that would have been unimaginable 14 months ago. Sarah, Robert, and Emma had a normal, pleasant conversation in the doorway for 5 minutes. They discussed Emma's progress in school, the soccer team she had recently joined, and the fact that Robert had gotten tickets to a concert that Emma was interested in attending. There was no tension, no barbs, no undercurrent of hostility. Just 3 people, a mother, a father, and a daughter, communicating like functional human beings. "Have her back by 7:00 p.m., Sarah said as Emma prepared to leave with her father. "Will do," Robert replied. "Come on, Emma, your grandma's making lasagna." As Emma left, Buddy jumped up and pressed against her legs. Emma knelt down to hug the dog. "I'll be back tomorrow, boy," she whispered. "You stay with Mommy tonight, okay? I'll see you in the morning." Buddy licked her face, and Emma stood up, her heart light in a way it hadn't been in a very long time. That evening, Judge sat in her own home, reviewing some preliminary legal documents for a new case, but her mind kept returning to the Henderson case. She had followed up with the family 3 months after her ruling and had been profoundly moved by what she found. Both parents were committed to the new arrangement. Emma was thriving. The conflict, while not completely resolved, had been transformed from an active, destructive battle into something more manageable. The judge had written a detailed summary of the case and had submitted it to the State Bar Association, along with a proposal for a new approach to custody cases involving children. She had suggested that judges be trained to recognize and honor the nonverbal communication that children and animals sometimes demonstrated together. She had suggested that courtrooms begin to acknowledge the ways that animals could reveal truths that human testimony sometimes obscured. Her proposal had generated considerable discussion in legal circles. Some judges were skeptical, arguing that allowing animals into courtrooms would set a dangerous precedent and could be manipulated by unscrupulous parties. But other judges and mental health professionals had reached out to Judge to discuss the theoretical underpinnings of what she had witnessed in the Henderson case. What Judge had recognized, and what she was now trying to communicate to the legal system at large, was something fundamental, that sometimes the most important truths in human relationships exist beyond the boundaries of formal procedure and legal language. Sometimes, a child's signal to a beloved animal, and that animal's unconditional response, could reveal more about what a child needed than any expert testimony ever could. 6 months later, Emma sat in the audience as her mother and father attended Emma's school play. They sat on opposite ends of the bleachers, but they were both present, both supportive, both proud. Buddy was not in the auditorium, pets were not allowed, but Emma had made the signal that morning before leaving for school, and Buddy had pressed against her with his full body weight, as if transferring all his calm strength to her. And it had worked. Emma had delivered her 3 lines with confidence and joy, and she had walked off that stage feeling like she was enough, like she was loved, like she was safe. Later at home, Emma sat with Buddy and wrote in her journal, "Today was good. Mommy and Daddy both came to my play. They didn't fight. Buddy helped me feel brave. I think we're going to be okay now. I think my family is healing." And in a small way, the entire legal system was healing too. Because one judge, confronted with the undeniable truth of a child's distress and an animal's response, had decided that justice required something more than following procedure. Justice required seeing the human being at the center of the case and prioritizing there above all else. Judge's ruling in Henderson v. Henderson became a landmark case, cited in family law textbooks and taught in law schools as an example of judicial wisdom transcending legal doctrine. It demonstrated that sometimes the most important verdicts are not rendered from the bench with a gavel, but are instead quietly whispered by a child to a faithful dog and echoed back through that animal's unconditional love.